When Starfield launched in September, I had a number of critiques to level at the PC version of the game. Poor graphical menu descriptions, and a lack of basic user experience options, as well as issues with CPU performance and big issues with Nvidia and Intel GPUs. The latest Starfield beta version released on Steam looks to address a number of the issues I critiqued at launch, so in today's video I will go over the changes I have seen in the new beta version of Starfield and what they mean for you, the player. So let us first start in the menu. Not too much has actually changed here. The options are honestly still rather poorly described, even though they do have great optimization potential as my optimized settings from my original review show. Bethesda really still needs to add in things like preview images to show what the options do. So the style is the same and I think they need to change it, but there is some more substance here. There are new options to give you a better user experience with the beta patch. First of all, there's a field of view option you can find in the accessibility menu. At launch, I found the FOV of the game to be frankly far too low for a first-person experience on PC. Now you can jack it up to high levels, get a far greater scope of the game world. This option, of course, should have been there at launch, but it's better late than never. Another thing, finally in the PC version, are some slight controls for HDR. Unfortunately, I have to report that the HDR resolve in its official form is really poor. I cannot show it in this video, which I've mastered in SDR, but believe me when I say the game in HDR just kind of looks like the SDR version of the game running with auto HDR on. The game still has a very flat look, and it just looks poor on modern displays such as OLEDs. The opening scene will show it off greatly if you were to load it up with the official HDR implementation. If you play with official HDR, the background in that opening scene has an off gray-yellow color with banding that you really shouldn't expect from a competent HDR solution. Here there's a community mod called Luma, which adds in real HDR to the game, and I can definitely say it triumphs over this official implementation. And if I were Bethesda, I would really look for inspiration from the community mod here as how to do it right. So not the best update in regard to HDR, but a good update is the addition of Nvidia's deep learning supersampling, also known as DLSS. You get the temporal spatial reconstruction technique and frame generation if you have a compatible RTX 4000 series GPU. One thing I find curious is that they've done as Nvidia recommends with named presets of performance, ultra performance, balanced quality, and DLAA. Yet FSR2 is still controlled with a percentage slider, which controls the resolution of the axes of the screen. So 50% on FSR2 is FSR2's performance mode, for example. Here I wish they had unified both of these scalars to either use the percentage scalar or use the preset names, as casual users might be a bit confused, but I still like seeing both of them here. As for the quality of DLSS's image reconstruction, I would say it looks just as good as the DLSS mod I investigated at launch. Like in this scene here, versus the native FSR2 implementation in this beta patch, we can see how DLSS 2 has much superior image stability and anti-aliasing, much like I measured at launch. And it's really one of the reasons that I implored Bethesda to add DLSS, as FSR2's quality was not sufficient enough to be a universal solution for all GPU types. So I think DLSS looks great. But I do have to report there have been some slight changes to FSR2. For example, as we can see here, some of the ghosting of FSR2 has been lessened. At launch, as we can see on the left, shooting your gun would show obvious many frame trails behind each ejected shell. You wouldn't see that with the DLSS mod at launch. As of the beta patch, this ghosting behind the ejected shells is reduced. It is still there a little bit, but it's much less visible than it was at launch. And of course, just like the mod before it, the official DLSS implementation does not have any of these ghosting issues. Sadly, not all the ghosting with FSR2 is eliminated as of this beta patch. When changing weapons, for example, or rapidly revealing or removing objects like the gun you see here, you will see the same level of ghosting with FSR2 as you saw in the launch version, which looks pretty weird, and I'm a bit surprised that the game still has this issue here. Other ghosting also remains, such as the ghosting that you see on particle effects, where the particles here in this beta branch version still have the same smearing and ghosting that we saw in the launch version, and the official DLSS version does not have that, much like the mod didn't have that at launch. So FSR2 is a little bit better, but it's mostly actually still the same. As a result of that, I would still really like Bethesda to officially implement Intel's XeSS. It would be a great alternative for for Intel Arc users and AMD users as it offers different quality. It should also be relatively painless given how there are mods which also already do the same thing for the game. Now, before I get into DLSS frame generation that you can enable in the menu now, I want to talk about performance, which is key to frame generation. Back at launch, I criticized two things about the performance. The first was the CPU burden that the game had. It scaled poorly across many threads in comparison to other Paragon examples like Cyberpunk 2077, and as a result, it had areas in the game like Aquila or other planets where the CPU load was extreme, leading to poor frame times on CPUs and no good way to improve performance with modern high-end CPUs, as the game didn't really scale well beyond 6 threads and cores. This has changed dramatically with the beta patch. As you can see here, the game running on a Ryzen 7800X3D shows a rather intense 20% performance uplift in the game now due to the beta patch. That is a really big performance increase so close to a game launch and from a single patch. And I think it really calls into question how actually optimized this game was at launch. Just a cursory glance shows what is happening. We can see greater utilization of the CPU threads and cores on this 7800X3D that is not shown in the previous version of the game. Essentially, more threads are burdened in a way, and the greater utilization is leading to higher performance. So modern CPU owners can rejoice and Starfield will run better. But how much better? It depends, I would say. One thing you can see in this footage that I'm showing here is that the beta patch on Steam still has those same little frame time hiccups that are there that was in the launch version of the game and in the otherwise live patch that you can download right now on things like the Microsoft Store. So the game is going to run better on average, but you will still see frame time spikes and stutters in the game. And I think Bethesda still needs to look into this and reduce these frame time spikes in future patches. For mid to low end users, I can also report that there is increased performance on lower end chips such as the Ryzen 5 3600. This has 2 less cores and 4 less threads and a lot less cache than the 7800X3D, yet we can see a similar 17% performance uplift at the same settings versus the launch code of the game. That brings the CPU so much closer to a consistent 60 FPS, which otherwise I would say was not really possible, as it had many dips into the 40s. It's kind of astonishing once again to see this level of CPU improvement so close to launch with no visible quality reduction in the game. This increased performance of the Ryzen 5 3600 actually makes me think that something like a performance mode might be possible on Xbox Series X consoles, as the CPU in that console often has similar performance to the Ryzen 5 3600 in a number of titles as we've measured at Digital Foundry. So on the CPU side of things, we can see some really great improvements here. And when combined with DLSS's official implementation of frame generation, as we can see here, we can get a rather awesome experience in Starfield now. As we can see, the performance is greatly increased by turning on DLSS frame generation when CPU limited here. But you will notice that it isn't a complete 2 times improvement of performance like we would usually expect in CPU limited titles. The game apparently has a max frame rate internally of around 165 or 167 FPS or so. I find this a bit unfortunate and a bit arbitrary of a number, and I really hope that Bethesda allows users to uncap the frame rate above this without any issues in the game. So another thing for Bethesda to look into and investigate for future patches. Coming over to GPU performance, the launch version of the game had 2 faces, so to speak. A good face, where if you were on AMD, I think the game ran reasonably well on your GPU. If you had Intel or Nvidia, your GPU was way underperforming vis-a-vis how it usually performs in nearly every other game on the market in comparison to similar AMD chips. For example, I measured the RX 6800 XT being 46% faster than the RTX 3080 at launch in the same scene at native 1440p with FSR2 and the highest settings preset. That is truly unheard of performance differential there between these GPUs, and this is a title that is not utilizing ray tracing, where we would usually expect to see bigger differences. The beta update to Starfield changes this. On the AMD side, the gains are very modest for the RX 6800 XT. Putting that launch version next to the current beta patch, we can see a 5% performance uplift for the beta patch between the two of them. A little uptick in performance here, but nothing too major. Going over to the RTX 3080 though, we can see a huge difference. The current patch increases the RTX 3080 performance at those same ultra settings and resolution by 30%. This is honestly pretty unheard of for AAA titles, and if we look at the frame times, we can also see that the frame time issue that the game had with ultra settings for shadows on Nvidia cards appears to be gone as well here. As I said at launch, Bethesda needed to work on its Nvidia specific path, and this performance difference I've measured here shows that they really have. Doing the vendor head-to-heads, we can see that the RX 6800 XT is still ahead by 18% over that RTX 3080, but it is no longer 50% faster at the same settings than the RTX 3080. It is still a somewhat statistically anomalous large lead for a rasterization title, but it makes a lot more sense in comparison to what we had at launch. Going down the stack to older mid-range GPUs, the gains are a bit less impressive. The RX 5700 has seen a roughly 6% performance uplift as of the latest patch. The RTX 2070 Super has had a more sizable 14% performance uplift versus its measured launch performance. Yet the ARC A770 has seen the least movement in my performance testing here, measured in this scene, with just 3% performance improvement at those same settings in total with the latest beta patch. Either way, when I put the three GPUs next to each other in comparison, we can see that the ARC A770 is still underperforming heavily in this title next to things that I would call its peers. The RTX 2070 Super and RX 5700 are now a great deal closer. Although I must say I do find it pretty weird that the 2070 Super is losing still measurably to that RX 5700, as the 2070 Super is often in a performance bracket above the RX 5700. Still, it is improved, and that's better than none at all. Getting to the end of this video here covering this beta patch on PC, I am seeing a lot that I like. The improved CPU performance is awesome. Many more people are going to be getting more stable 60 FPS in this game, and that is thanks to better CPU utilization for many cored CPUs. The game is going to be less single-threaded. As for user experience, I like seeing frame generation, DLSS, and an FOV slider, but I'm really most impressed by the GPU performance uplifts that Bethesda has made possible here. A near 30% performance uplift at the same visual quality for the RTX 3080 is astonishing and really should be praised, though I do think it shows quite well how unoptimized this game was at launch on Nvidia GPUs. In regards to things that I think should still be better, I would really like to see more work put into HDR, as the resolve is still pretty poor as of this beta patch. The CPU performance is a good deal better, but the annoying traversal stutter that I saw at launch is still in the game, and everyone's going to be seeing this, even on big CPUs. And although the GPU performance is much better on Nvidia chips, not all GPUs are treated equally. Intel GPUs like the A770 still need a lot more love. But that's really all I can say. If you did enjoy this video covering the beta patch for Starfield, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Support us on Patreon to enable more videos like this in the future, where we go back to games after launch to see how they're faring. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.